Hi everyone, welcome. I'm preparing to check in on my VermiBag Mini. It's got some red wigglers living in there. And the worms have been in their system for, well, let me get it here in front of you. It's been 154 days since we launched this system, and we launched it in a slightly different way than we normally do. We had a number of buckets in which the worms had been living for 6 months. And then we took the worms, all the castings they produced over those 6 months and everything, and we just dropped everything right into here. And it's been running this way for now 22 weeks, and we have an estimated worm count in here of over 3,100 worms, and that's a lot of mouths to feed. So 11 days have passed since we last fed them. That last feeding was feeding number 12. So I'm preparing to give them feeding number 13. That feeding we gave them 11 days ago was pretty lame. It was all this kind of really dry, decorative gourd, pumpkin type stuff that you see put out at Halloween, and it just seemed to me like a really kind of underwhelming feeding. So I really wanted to kind of try to make up for it, so I got all kinds of yummy stuff for them today. Banana peels, pumpkin, apple peels, coffee. I've even got some grit here if we need it, or even some supplemental bedding. So let's get the camera situated so we can see what's happening down in the VermiBag Mini, and let's get these little guys fed. The other thing I've got within arm's reach in case we need it is my squirt bottle, and we talked about possibly using it on a couple occasions in previous check-ins, but we've not found it necessary to do so. So it's been really nice to come in here and find that, for example, right here beneath the plastic, that there's moisture on all of this material that had been thrown in here, and all these little tiny dark spots you see every place are just signs of worms traveling around here, dropping off their little castings. Not a whole lot of it, but you know, enough to tell me that there's sufficient moisture that the worms are even coming out to the surface to hang out, possibly trying to collect some little droplets of moisture that we're attempting to, you know, in vapor form, leave the system through evaporation and just collecting on that plastic, and all those little dew droplets were probably a nice little sip for the worms to partake in. You might have noticed, I don't know, it was a little difficult to see, but I do actually have an additional pumpkin stem as part of their feeding today, along with the pumpkin bits, and that's one of the unusual little things we're going to find in this system are these pumpkin stems that actually were placed into the yellow buckets that these worms came out of, and came over with the worms when we relocated them. So I guess I didn't remember correctly. I thought that I had managed to break these gourds up pretty good last time, but perhaps this one was just a little too tough for me to be able to break up last time. This time it seems like it's a little bit more fragile and willing to give. It even seems like a few worms have made their way inside of the thing, which is kind of cool. I just thought I might be able to even, you know, why don't we do that right now? Before I forget. I thought it would be kind of cool to throw something with a little bit of additional moisture content down into the gourd, like a little piece of actual pumpkin that they can enjoy down in there. Maybe even a couple little pieces of, I was going to say a couple little pieces of apple peel, but this is like one huge continuous strip of apple peel. Compliments of my mom. So I wasn't aware of the fact that she peels it in one continuous strip that way. So this way perhaps this gourd will be a little bit more interesting, or at least the insides of it will be a little bit more interesting for worm traffic, now that we've stuffed it full of juicy fruit and vegetable matter. Here we have another gourd, which I was able to break up a little bit better last time. And look at all those worms hanging out inside this thing. Awesome. That's cool. They must be enjoying this thing. I thought they would not really like it because it seemed like it was so dry and boring. So here's some more pumpkin stem. We're going to bump into more of those as we go, because there was a whole bunch of them thrown in here. And there was even a time-lapse filmed within this container through that little view window of an entire pumpkin getting consumed in here. And that's, I think, that one of those stems we're going to bump into, or maybe one of the stems that we've already seen were the stem from that pumpkin. So there's just some unusual foods in here, that's for sure. But it does look like the worms don't mind, you know. They're actually seeming to enjoy some of these foods that we threw in here. Stuff that I thought they would not find very interesting, but they're evidently cruising this stuff and nibbling on it already, which is awesome. It's kind of what you're supposed to see happening, but I was skeptical as to whether that was actually happening in here or not, so I guess I took it to heart perhaps a little bit too much. These are stems of banana, and they're going to be getting a few more of those today. Yeah, that's a pretty nice feeding I put together for them, with the assumption that what they'd gotten previously was kind of lame and that they might appreciate a little treat. So whatever, they're getting they're getting this nice little assortment of delicious foods, which I'm sure is going to pique their interest. So let's leave the excavation of the feeding zone at that. I keep needing to remind myself that I don't want to go too deep in here. Like I said earlier, I did load this thing up with a bunch of pretty much finished castings that came out of the buckets that the worms had lived in previously. And I really wanted to allow that stuff to remain down low within the system without getting littered with all kinds of uncomposted bits of bedding type materials and things like that. So I keep needing to remind myself not to dig too deep down into the system, even though I'm kind of curious sometimes to see what's happening down low. But I think it was during the last check-in, or perhaps the check-in previous to that, that we did actually just probe a little bit deeper down just to make sure moisture was okay down there, and it was. So that was good. You know, we didn't find anything that was going to give us reason for alarm or concern, so we went ahead and we just backfilled the hole as quickly as we had dug down into it, and there's really no need for further inspection because I'm certain that it's still just as good as it was that last time we inspected it, just for a quick reality check to make sure everything's a-okay down there. So I've returned pretty much all the leftover things that I located along the way excavating the feeding zone, and I think we can probably just go right in with the fresh foods. I just wondered if perhaps a little bit more bedding wouldn't hurt as a little bit of a foundation into which we can drop today's food. So I've got it right here. We might as well use it, right? So let's grab a handful. You might have noticed how much bedding was out on the surface when we first opened the system up. The whole top was covered in my prepared bedding. And perhaps it would be a good idea to do that again, because sometimes I do kind of wonder if I'm a little bit stingy when it comes to bedding, and maybe I am. So let's try to, try to reverse that in case I'm correct about me being stingy. If I am, then I don't want to be, and I'd rather try to address it rather than be in denial about it. And what we'll do is we're going to hang on to this last coffee filter here in which the coffee was located, and we're going to use that at the very end just to mark where we fed, because that's kind of a little tradition in my wormery, is to mark where we last fed. But these two coffee filters being placed right below the food, I've got a funny feeling that they're just not going to last. They're going to get gobbled up 1, 2, 3, because all these delicious food items that we're bringing in today are going to be piled right on top of all that stuff, kind of putting it right in the line of fire. And something tells me the worms are going to do a number on those two coffee filters beneath the food. All this pumpkin, or at least, I don't know, I'm assuming it's going to dump moisture out. Every time I've ever frozen pumpkin like this and then I watched it thaw, sometimes I don't really put it into the worm bin frozen. Sometimes I let it thaw, but when I do, it you know, kind of leaves behind a whole bunch of moisture. So I've got a funny feeling that that's what it's going to do here again today. So moisture is definitely not going to be an issue in this system. And that looks to me like a pretty nice feeding. Let's get rid of the last few things that are holding out and still remaining within the transport container. And then, oh yeah, I had this napkin over here too. I've got this napkin which we can also put in. Let's first sprinkle in some of this crushed eggshell as grit, which the worms are probably going to be able to make use of too. And that to me is starting to look like a pretty nice feeding zone. And no, we're not going to give them any more of these. At least not today, but I'm glad to see that they actually went over a lot better than I thought they would. I had this feeling that they wouldn't really be well received, but I was mistaken, and I'm glad to see that I was. So it's kind of nice to see that the worms are appreciating that stuff and making good use of it. So that's cool. Happy to see it. And it kind of also makes me feel like I can go ahead and use that stuff elsewhere. And I've got a couple more up in the kitchen too, so I've got, besides those two I just showed you, I think I've got 2 more upstairs. So I got a couple more of those that I can feed with. And you know, this last piece of paper here, sometimes I use top covering pieces of paper in my systems. And usually it's newspaper, but perhaps we can just use some of this out here. We'll lay down the feeding zone indicator to show where we last fed. Right over here. Well, it's pretty obvious in a system like this where you last fed. I pretty much always go down the middle. And then in can come these 2 nice large pieces of paper. Just a little variation from what we had going on when we first arrived. Just some more stuff for the worms to nibble on. They always appreciate their bedding material, and all this paper ultimately starts out as bedding, but eventually just becomes another food item, because the worms will eventually eat everything you put in, whether you classify it as bedding or food or grit or whatever. It all ends up getting ingested and turns into lovely worm castings in the end. So that's it for the video. I got a busted glove here, so that's the end of that one. At least I got a few uses out of it, but I won't be washing it off this time. It goes straight in the trash. So before I go, let me just really quickly say thank you. Thank you so much for watching. Hopefully you enjoyed the video. If you did, as always, please don't forget to leave me a quick thumbs up before you go. That's always really appreciated. And if you haven't done so already, please also consider subscribing to the channel. That's very much appreciated as well. All right, everyone, thanks so much for watching. Have a great day. Bye now.